This is our Simondon reading group, continuing with our reading of Individuation, Volume 2, the text History of the Notion of the Individual. We stopped last time on page 566 of the PDF, and we're on the section on Descartes. We're about halfway through that section, and so we looked at Simondon's analysis of the cogito argument, and he points out something that I think is a little bit distinct from maybe some other commentators on this very famous argument. Is that in Descartes' presentation, there's a sort of step from there's a sort of argument that passes from the initial idea of this evil genie that sort of makes me mistake anything that I think about. When I try to add 2 plus 2, or when I try to count the sides of a square, this spirit makes me make a mistake every time. But when I think something like I think, or I doubt, or any other action of the intellect, it's impossible for me to be mistaken about my existence, because if this evil spirit is making me mistaken, is sort of tricking me in some way, then I have to be substantially distinct. I have to be a distinct substance or a distinct entity from that spirit, and so I have to be something, no matter what, how mistaken I might be about what I am or what kind of thing I am. I'm still something. I'm not nothing. So it's there's this moment of the substantial distinctness of me as a thinking thing. I have to be substantially distinct from this evil spirit, no matter how mistaken I might be about anything else. And so that's a sort of interesting analysis of the cogito argument that Simondon provides here. And then he also talks about one of the key difficulties, or probably the key difficulty of the Cartesian doctrine, which is the union of the body and the soul. So the cogito proves that I exist, but it does so only insofar as I'm a thinking thing, insofar as I'm something that thinks. And Descartes holds that this thinking is the essence of what I am. So I am essentially a thinking thing, and the thinking thing, or the soul, is a substance. So it's something that exists in its own right, and not in something else. And then this substance, the thinking thing, has to be distinct from the body, an extended thing, because we can conceive them to be separate. We can think of a body without thought, and we can think of the soul as being separate from the body. And so, because we can conceive them as separate, they have to be distinct substances. They can't belong to the same entity. But at the same time, even though the body and the soul are distinct substances, they're united in some way, because we know that we can will to move our hand, or to write, or walk, or whatever. And we also experience sensations when our body is affected by various other bodies in the world surrounding us. And so there's some sort of union between the body and the soul. But Descartes holds that this union is something that surpasses human understanding. We know that there is a union, and we know that we are a combination of body and soul, but we can't understand how this union comes about. It's something that God does by a sort of specific act. He unites the body and the soul, and we can't understand how this union happens. And so a lot of people, even in the 17th century, found this explanation, or sort of non-explanation, not very satisfying. They wanted to have a comprehensible account of how the body and the soul interact with each other, or are united with each other. So this is sort of the key point of difficulty in the Cartesian doctrine. And then we also, the last thing I think I want to mention before we get started on today's reading is there was this footnote which is footnote 95 in the translation, or endnote 95, I should say, which is a long endnote, about a page long, which, for whatever reason, Simondon sort of inserts a summary, like a one-page summary of his whole philosophical system of individuation and transductive thinking and so on, into this study of Descartes' philosophy. So anyone who's following along on the translation should make sure to look at the endnote, that one-page endnote, because it's a very important explanation or summary of the whole philosophical system. Okay, so yeah, let's start on today's reading. Angus, if you want to start, from here again, the paradoxical.
Yeah, no problem. Here again, the paradoxical aspect of the individual becomes apparent. The ordered action is not one that is locked into the choice of what is predictable and already given. Such an action would be fruitless. To be ordered in singular, action must surpass itself and always be new. Action is a gesture based on a situation that transforms this situation so as to justify itself in this transformed situation. The gesture unfolds according to the situation that it creates. It can only insert itself in the situation that it creates. The individual can realize its unity only. The individual can realize its unity only. It must be only by seeming to detach from its identity. There is identity only at the end of action. The conditions of generous action require a superabundance of being. The individual is the source of this superabundance of being in the situation through which he universalizes himself by resolving the problem that held him captive in the particularity of a singular situation. The Cid has rediscovered universality. This is the meaning of the words proclaimed by the king at the end of the tragedy. It is no longer merely a matter of knowing if the Cid will be able to marry Chimène, but of learning that this exceptional situation has come to an end. That is the true resolution of the work. The two incompatible obligations have been compatibilized through generous action. For Descartes, the incompatibilities become indeterminations. There isn't one term too many, but not enough given. It's the individual who determines the givens by completing them through his action. The individual is creator of universality. This is how the foremost character of Descartes' method is explained, which founds method in the knowledge that the intelligence grasps of its own nature, and consequently of the conditions of its exercise. Quote-unquote universal science resides in this knowledge of the intelligence. For Descartes, this intellectus is a starting point and a fulcrum. The certainty of intuitive knowledge can gradually extend to the truths that depend on it. Intuition, this natural light, in quotes, this quote-unquote intellectual instinct, allows us to perceive not only truths, but also the link between a truth and that which immediately depends on it. Deduction, which is a connection between truth and is always exerted on certain propositions but never on probable propositions, supposes that the mind can have a full and complete certainty of a particular object without having a total certainty concerning the real as a whole. The human individual's limitation does not prevent intellectual knowledge of the real. It merely forces us to employ a method that ensures the transfer of certainty. For this method to be fruitful, it must be constructive. Measurement guarantees certainty, order guarantees fruitfulness. Descartes' great methodological discovery is that of the connection between measurement and order. Before him, order indeed existed as a philosophical principle, particularly in Neoplatonism. This order was a hierarchical arrangement of heterogeneous realities that did not permit the exercise of measurement. That is because there is measurement only of the homogeneous. For Descartes, on the contrary, order is a progress of the homogeneous. It therefore permits measurement.
Yeah, we can stop here for now. This is a multi-page paragraph, as we often experience with Simondon. Right, so we're still discussing Descartes' moral philosophy, and so this moral philosophy is presented as a provisional morals, or provisional system of ethics. So we as we start in our understanding of the world, we have to sort of forget everything that we learned in school, the scholastic philosophy. We have to almost start from zero and sort of reconstruct the system of human knowledge. And so ultimately, we would like to have a a system of ethics that would allow us to sort of derive our ethical or moral principles from an established science. But in the meantime, while we're still constructing that science, we still need to act in the world. We can't sort of wait until we have a perfect science before we decide, whether to join this army like Descartes did, or swear allegiance to whatever prince, or vote for whatever political candidate. We still have to act in the world while we're waiting for this complete science to be established. And so Simondon's analysis here of this provisional morality is that this provisional system is actually sort of the definitive system for Descartes, because we're finite beings. We'll never have that established complete science of the world that would allow us to derive a non-provisional morality. So it's this system of provisional morality that is sort of the final morality for Descartes. And Simondon analyzes it in terms of his own concepts of the problem, and reconciling incompatible aspects of a problem situation. He refers here to Corneille's tragedy Le Cid, which I have not read, so I can't really explain some of these references that are a little bit obscure. But the idea here, as far as I can understand it, is that in facing a problem, a problem consists of some kind of incompatible propositions or incompatible goals that we want to realize. So we have an obligation to do X and an obligation to do Y, but X and Y are incompatible with each other in some way. And solving this problem consists in finding some third term, some further determination of the problem that allows for those two terms to become compatible. So they were incompatible, and now they're compatible with each other as a result of this further determination of the problem. And so this is sort of the general form of what a problem solving effort consists in, as far as Simondon interprets Descartes' system here. And then he passes on to a discussion of the idea of method. And so this is, of course, a central idea for Descartes. One of his first texts was the Discourse on Method, which is sort of his introduction to his new approach to science. And one of the key ideas is this notion of deduction as transmitting certainty. So we start from something that is completely certain, like the cogito, or specifically the cogito, our certainty of our own existence. And then we deduce from this absolutely certain proposition, we deduce other propositions that receive their own certainty, that is transmitted from the cogito to this second proposition, and then that certainty is again transmitted to a third, and so on. And this notion of method brings about a sort of transformation of the representation of order, because now we have to understand order. So previous philosophical systems, like the Neoplatonists that Simondon refers to here, had understood order in hierarchical terms. So there's an order of the universe, in the sense that there's a hierarchy of beings, with the humans somewhere near the bottom, slightly above the realm of pure matter, which is the lowest level. And then human beings are above that level because we have an intellect and intellectual capacities to grasp the forms. And then there's the realm of the forms, and then there's the realm of the one, or the order of the one above the form. This is the sort of Neoplatonist picture of the hierarchy of beings. Whereas for Descartes, we have a notion of order that does not depend on a hierarchy of beings. So we can apply something like measurements to the way order is understood. And we should think here, I think, of the Cartesian coordinates. So one of Descartes' sort of methodological innovations in geometry was to associate a pair of numbers with every point on a plane. So what we now describe as X and Y coordinates. And this is something that, of course, we teach, I don't know, in grade grade 3 or 4 or something today, we teach kids how to draw a curve based on a set of numbers, or to take a shape and find the numbers associated with the points of that shape. But this was a new idea that Descartes introduces, and it allows for the solution of various geometrical problems that can't be solved without passing through the numerical sort of order. And Descartes takes this to also apply to the physical world, so we can understand how physical bodies interact using geometrical knowledge that we derive from this Cartesian coordinate approach. And so there's a kind of, because the whole world is homogeneous in this sense, it is not sort of divided up into different realms, different levels of being. Because of this homogeneity, we can apply the same notions of order and measure that we use in geometry. We can apply them to physical understanding of the world as well.
One thing in this that section I just read that isn't totally clear to me is this notion of universality, as the individual is creator of universality at the end of this process of problem resolution. I don't know if there's a connection here between the ethical problem resolution and the deductive progression in the argument from the cogito. I know in the next section where he talks about Pascal, he talks about how an invention is a response to a problem, and the invention is there's always something singular and not generalizable about the invention that responds to a particular problem. So maybe the universality is the generalizability of a response to the problem, which is somehow related to the transferability that I guess is possible in the homogeneity that you were discussing, as exemplified by the Cartesian coordinates.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. In the ethical order or the moral order, we are faced with singular problems, in the sense that we have to decide, do I join this army, or do I stay at home and study mathematics, or whatever the exact choice was that Descartes was faced with. We have to, it's me as this particular, as this singular being, faced with this specific situation, this choice that happens at this particular moment in time, that has to make a decision. And so this problem solving that I have to perform is as a kind of singularity to it. It's not something that has a generality to it. But then at the same time, when I do find a solution, when I make compatible what previously was incompatible, this solution has a kind of universality to it, in the sense that I it's something that can be applied outside the particular decision that I made in this particular circumstance. So I can sort of set out the principle of how I made this decision, or I can explain it to someone else, and it can be sort of reused in other circumstances. And I think this sort of dual aspect of the singular and the universal, we also find in the deductive argumentation, because that's a kind of problem solving as well. So the cogito is always singular. It's always me as this thinking being that becomes certain of my own existence. But at the same time, it's something that any thinking being can perform, and have the same certainty of their own existence. So there's a kind of, I guess, reversibility between the singular and the general in the cogito. And then as a result of this sort of reversibility, this experience of the cogito founds a system of universal knowledge. So because anyone can perform the cogito just as well as I can, or just as completely as I can, I can derive universal knowledge from the cogito, even though it's a kind of singular experience on the other side, and then I can deduce, the existence of the soul and its separateness from the body, and the existence of God, and I can, found the whole system of knowledge on these propositions, and then everything sort of follows from there. So the universal science is a sort of consequence of the singular experience of the cogito. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. Ali, would you like to read? Oh, okay, maybe you're not available to read. Okay, I can read the next bit. Let's see, where did we finish? Right. Okay. Descartes accomplished in the sciences an effort that consisted in creating the homogeneity of the object where it didn't visibly exist. In mathematics, for example, Descartes showed that all geometrical realities could be put into equations through the intermediary of a coordinate system, and so reduced to their projections over the axes and to the measurement of these projections. The geometrical rapports become homogeneous, for they are all expressible as the lengths of straight segments, which is translatable into algebraic numbers. The point of this reduction is not just to permit measurement, but to realize homogeneity. This homogeneity of the object is what allows for progress through transfer of certainty, or, as Descartes says, the transport of evidence. Descartes knew how to make homogeneity appear in domains where it wasn't visible. This homogeneity is the fundamental condition of knowledge and of the individual's universality. Indeed, when the real is homogeneous, knowledge of the particular object is possible and can provide a full and complete certainty. If the real were heterogeneous, each object would first require choosing the suitable type of knowledge, and this determination of the type of knowledge could only occur based on a higher principle that wouldn't reside in the knowledge of each thing, because it would be the condition of such knowledge. The realism of knowledge is another expression of this homogeneity of the object. Each particular proposition can be true, for the notion is not concept but idea. It does not suppose a plurality of experiences, the necessary basis for abstractive induction and conceptual. Knowledge starts with true and immutable natures provided by intellectual intuition. Here we come back to the reality of the individual. The individual has within him the intuition of true and immutable natures. In its principle, knowledge is direct relation of the mind to its object. No mediation, no preliminary induction is necessary. The individual being is not disinherited. He finds the conditions of true knowledge in isolation, at least at the start. Realism, homogeneity, and continuity of the real. These are the postulates of Cartesian thought. So again, we have this discussion of homogeneity, as sort of realized in the Cartesian coordinates. So we can take any sort of curve, any sort of shape, and we can translate it into the form of an equation, which is just some sort of relation between an x and a y coordinate, and so everything in the world of extension, in the world of extended things, is ultimately just some sort of x and y coordinates, in some sort of relation to each other. And in particular, or another aspect of this homogeneity, is that we don't need to have conceptual knowledge of entities first. We don't need to sort of start from a knowledge of what a human being is before we can understand who I am or what I am. And this is something that Descartes explicitly mentions, that he in the Meditations, that I have this I learned in school, or I have this idea that a human being is a rational animal, and so I could try to define myself, what I am, as saying that I am a rational animal, but then I would need to first understand what an animal is, and then what rational is, and then how to combine those two. And then each of those terms would require further investigation. An animal, to understand what an animal is, I'd have to understand what a living being is, and so on. So if you can only have knowledge of things through concepts, you have a sort of infinite regress of each concept presupposes some other concepts that you need to understand in order to understand the first concept. And then, so Descartes here has instead this idea of intuitive knowledge of the natures of things. So when I perform the cogito and recognize that I am a thinking thing, I don't first have to form a concept of what a thinking thing is in general, and then decide that I fall under that concept, that I'm an entity to which that concept applies. I have a sort of immediate knowledge of myself as a thinking thing. And it's this immediate knowledge that allows for sort of progress of knowledge and not have this infinite regress of concepts that you would have otherwise. So this is another form of homogeneity, or another kind of homogeneity, because every entity is sort of graspable in terms of intuitive knowledge, in terms of an idea, as opposed to a concept that would classify those entities. So it's a knowledge occurs through intuition and not through classification. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. Would someone else like to read from the top of 568? Now this system. Sure.
Now, this system would be perfectly coherent, perfect harmony, but the hue also is abstract, innate ideas. There are adventitious ideas and factive, and in addition to intelligence, there is also the quality, the passions and tendencies. The discontinuity and heterogeneity are an insofar as no deductive relation. It be said that this and that more with the help of medicine, but homogeneity, and Descartes has full of his. Nevertheless, practically are this duality, if deductive knowledge, to ensure the extended heterogeneity, the understood so far as by its for clarity, the senses and the imagination that are head or an in. However, the body.
Right. Yeah. So here we have this is Simondon's reflection on this homogeneity and heterogeneity. There's a sort of again, I would want to use the word dialectic here, even though this is not how Simondon would describe it. But there's a kind of transition or interrelation between homogeneity and heterogeneity, in the sense that Descartes wants to found the knowledge of the extended universe, of the natural world, or the physical world, on this sort of presupposition of homogeneity. So everything physical is an extended thing, and that's what its nature consists in. And that allows us to have geometrical knowledge of these extended things, and ultimately that's what allows us to have knowledge of the physical world. But this same homogeneity of the natural world, or the physical world, when it comes to this one particular body, which is my body, or more generally the human body, introduces this heterogeneity, in the sense that the body and the soul are radically heterogeneous. They're radically different natures to each other. And the body, through sensation, introduces something heterogeneous into our experience. So we experience things as being colored, hot or cold, having particular tastes, and so on, which are all these properties that don't inhere in things as they are in themselves, but are results of the way that these bodies affect us. And so our knowledge has this. Our knowledge of bodies is always a sort of is intermingled with this affection by the bodies. So when Descartes gives his famous example of the piece of wax, he talks about how the wax has a certain smell, it has a certain shape and texture and color, and so on. All these properties are what we sort of first notice about this piece of wax, but it's only when we sort of abstract from these sensible qualities and grasp the piece of wax as just a portion of extension through an intellectual grasping of the entity. It's only then that we truly have knowledge of the entity. So there's a heterogeneity that between the true knowledge of an extended thing, which is intellectual, and this sensible affection by that thing. And so it's the same homogeneity of the extended world that makes knowledge of that world possible. Also introduces heterogeneity within my experience, or my mind, insofar as my body, to which my mind is associated, or the soul is associated, can be affected by other bodies, and have the resulting sensations occur in my mind. And so this homogeneity creates heterogeneity in my mind.
I can read the next page or so.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Nevertheless, the unique and ultimate principle is not the inherence of innate ideas to the individual. This principle is first according to the order of reasons, but it supposes that ideas are comparable. In this comparison, supposes the idea of the absolutely perfect being. The whole activity of the intellect supposes this idea, which is the first and clearest of all, relative to which finite and limited beings are conceived. The individual is not the author of its being. The principle of lossless transfer is valid in this case, as in every other case. Quote, there is at least as much formal reality in the cause of an idea as there is objective reality in the idea itself. Unquote. This principle is not different from that of the construction of realities. It is when we analyze the type of causality by which things can be produced and by which ideas can be formed that we understand that there must be a cause of the notions within us. These ideas are something real. If they weren't something real, they would not require a cause that has a formal reality. For Descartes, the reality of a thing is known when we know how it can be constructed. The idea's objective reality consists of reality. It is not a simple image without consistency. Realism is necessary for the demonstration of the existence of God in the third meditation to be valid. Here, Descartes employs a mode of thought that not only separates it completely from every non-realist theory, but also elevates it to the veritable status of being, what we now call information, and which in Descartes is called the objective reality of an idea. This information is implicitly quantified and not just qualified by Descartes, since the reason why the idea of the infinite and the perfect cannot be recognized as factitious or adventitious is because it possesses an objective reality superior to that of any other reality of our thoughts. It thus cannot have been fabricated by the mind, which would have arbitrarily augmented and brought together in a fictive being the perfections of which it has the idea based on the experience of the senses. The human individual who is imperfect does not have enough formal reality to be the author of the infinite and perfect idea, whose objective reality is so great that it requires as its author a being that is itself innate and perfect, i.e., in possession of an infinite and perfect formal reality. The objective reality of an idea is a reality that can be one of the terms of the relation of causality, the other term of which is a formal reality. It is therefore unnecessary to prove existence before essence. There is a link of reality between essence and existence. This idea that the idea of the perfect being is is an idea that the human mind is not capable of causing makes sense to me, but I don't really follow why he's calling this an information in the sense in which he uses this in volume 1 to mean like the resolution of the desperation.
Right. Yeah, this is a kind of a difficult point here. So maybe I'll start with a terminological point about Descartes' terminology. So he uses these terms formal and objective being, and it can be a little bit misleading because when Descartes talks about objective being, he means being in the mind. Uh, so it's what we would call probably subjective as opposed to objective, and then formal being is being outside of the mind. And the argument, so Descartes' argument for, or one of the arguments he presents for the existence of God is has to do with the sort of quantity of reality that is contained in the idea of God. So we Descartes has sort of swept clean the all the ideas that he all the things that he accepted as true from his childhood, from his education and everything, and then he performs the cogito and determines that he can be certain at least of his own existence. And then he sort of notices that he has this idea of God or of a perfect being, and he asks whether this idea so this idea has objective existence, and he wants to know whether there's a formal existence of the of God outside the idea or outside of the intellect. And his argument is that because I am a finite being, I I have only a limited formal reality. My degree of reality or quantity of reality is limited. You can assign a number to how much I exist or my degree of existence. And the idea of a perfect being is something to which no number can be assigned, is greater than any finite number, whatever number we would assign to degree of reality. And so this formal, the objective being of the an entity such that nothing greater than it can be conceived, is something that surpasses the existence of the formal reality that I contain, so my degree of existence. And the reason I think why Simondo wants to call this an information here is I think he's using the term information uh, not so much in his specific sense of the resolution of a disparation and so on, but I think he's talking about what he elsewhere calls quantity of information. So the more sort of traditional communication theory meaning of information. And so the idea is that if we consider the idea of God as a kind of signal or a kind of message, it contains more information than I, as the finite being, am capable of sort of contributing to a message. It contains a greater quantity of information than I am capable of transmitting. And so, if I find this signal sort of appears within me, then I have to assume, or I have to deduce that the source of this signal is outside of me, is not something that is within me. So I think the answer to your question is that he's using information here to mean quantity of information and not his own specific meaning of information.
Thanks. That's great. That makes a lot of sense.
So the sort of two steps to the argument that Descartes is giving for the existence of God is that first we show that the idea of God that I have can't be something that I produced. It has greater reality than I have. It's something that surpasses my ability to produce. So it's something that came to me from outside of me, or it was caused by something outside of me. And then the second step is to say that because I have this clear and distinct idea of God, and all of my clear and distinct ideas are true, therefore the source of this idea is God himself. So the first step is the idea is not something that is not caused by me or is not brought about by me. It has to come from outside of me. And then the second step is identifying the source of this idea as being God and not some other finite being or some other entity outside of me. And so as a result of these two steps, we can conclude that God, as the being of which we can attribute, or to which we can attribute all perfections, this being that has the greatest degree of existence possible, this being exists, and not just within my intellect, but outside of me. And so that was what he sort of set out to show when he considers this notion of God that I have within my mind, is this external reality, or this external existence of God, and not just in my intellect. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read. Where?
Right. This is certainly
Right. Okay. Thank you.
no problem.
This is certainly the most profound and also the newest aspect of Descartes' thought. By making information into a reality, Descartes gives the individual the role of an operator of information. This worker has limited forces, and he recognizes a being which is anterior and superior to him when he discovers a work of information that he cannot have made himself. The idea of the infinite and of the perfect is more than the mark of the worker stamped on his product. It is a work that remains operating as an active principle of information because this idea is the principle of judgment. Without it, methodical doubt would not be possible. It is given firstly. Knowledge is not a participation because the essences that are the object of human understanding are creatures of God. God is the guarantor of our knowledge, not through an attribute that relates to his understanding, but through attributes that relate to his creative power, omnipotence, and goodness. The human understanding takes this clear and distinct knowledge as a starting point and seeks out its combinations and effects. The calling of the individual being is to be the agent of this knowledge in its development. Man extends the creative activity of God. He is not just the foreman of creation, he also elaborates knowledge based on principles created by God. I'm going to stop here because there's a couple things to talk about in this passage before we go on to the next bit. So there's the one bit where Simondon says that without God, methodical doubt would not be possible. So this is referring back to, I believe, the first meditation, or possibly the second, I can't remember. Where Descartes brings up the idea of this evil spirit that makes me make mistakes or be in error every time that I try to make a judgment. And he points out that so he first brings up the fact of dreaming. So something that seems immediately obvious, like the fact that I'm sitting at my desk right now. It's something that I seem to have certain knowledge of is something that I can doubt because I remember that in my dreams I sometimes think that I'm walking in the street when actually I'm lying in bed, and I sometimes think that I'm doing something when I'm dreaming, when in fact I'm actually not doing that thing, or something that seems sort of immediately obvious is something I can be mistaken about when I'm dreaming. And so because of this, I should not sort of take these propositions as certain, that I have to prove that I can have knowledge of any of these things. But then when I turn to mathematical propositions, it seems like if I try to add 2 plus 2, whether I'm dreaming or not, the answer is still going to be 4. Or if I try to count the sides of a square and so on, any of these mathematical propositions, it seems like it doesn't really matter whether I'm dreaming or not. I still have knowledge of these propositions. And so it's here that Descartes has to appeal to this evil spirit, or this entity, this much more powerful entity than me, who is capable of making me make a mistake every time I try to add 2 plus 2, or whatever other mathematical task I set myself. uh, and so it's only because I can think of an entity, an omnipotent entity that can make me make mistakes. It's only because of this that I can doubt mathematical propositions, and so this is why the existence of God is necessary for methodical doubt. But then it's only later, once I prove that God exists outside of my intellect, and that I understand that God as a perfect being can't be evil or malicious and deceitful. It's only then that I can understand that God as a perfect being would not deceive me in performing mathematical tasks. And so, if something like 2 plus 2 equals 4, if I conceive this proposition, then I know it's true. So it's only later in the development, once I show that God as a perfect being is also benevolent and not deceitful, that I can conclude that mathematical propositions are true. And Descartes also holds the sort of paradoxical position that mathematical truths and necessary truths in general are the product of God's volition. So God willed that 2 plus 2 should equal 4, and he could have willed otherwise. He could have decided that 2 plus 2 would equal 5, or he could have decided that triangle would have angles that are greater than 2 right angles, or whatever other mathematical or logical proposition could have been otherwise if God had decided to create it otherwise. And so our knowledge, so it's not just our knowledge of mathematical propositions that depends on our knowledge of God as a beneficent being, but the existence or the obtaining of these mathematical and logical propositions also depends on God, on God's will. So there's a sort of double dependence. There's an epistemological dependence of our knowledge of these mathematical and logical propositions on our knowledge of God. And then there's an ontological dependence of the obtaining of these propositions on God's will. So the moment of, or this point in the deduction where Descartes deduces that God exists independently of me or outside my intellect, and also that God is beneficent, is sort of the hinge around which everything else rotates. And so without that, I can't actually have any certain knowledge about the world at all. Okay, let's go on to the next bit from And Yet.
I can read again. And yet, a difficulty always remains concerning the heterogeneity of the soul and the body. The individual appears to be created by God, but for thought alone. Isn't it necessary to begin again with a new study for the body? The body also appreciates through pleasure and pain that a thing is useful or harmful to it. Pleasure is the mark of an augmentation of being. According to what principle is this qualitative appreciation possible? Following the same reasoning as the one Descartes applies to ideas, could we not thereby manage to discover the existence of a formal reality distinct from the body and more powerful than it? For it could be that a number of these qualitative appreciations carried by way of the body surpass the reactions arising from the adventitious state or factitious acquisitions due to some corporeal elaboration. As tendency or instinct, this would therefore be in the individual the mark of a reality superior to the individual, a formal reality great enough to cause the objective reality of the instinct or tendency. This reality could certainly be found to be identical to the one to which the idea of the infinite and the perfect refers. But then the non-homogeneity between the mind and the body would persist. The body is not just an operator of information. It assimilates, generates, dissimilates, develops, ages, mates. These operations are not operations of pure production. They imply types of organization that are not merely the transfer of a quantity of movement or of an information. The body integrates and differentiates. Descartes privileged the operative aspect of constructive thought in the individual and more generally everything that is operative. He supposes given structures in the body, like that of the heart, and shows that life is just a functioning of these structures. Founded on homogeneity and continuity, his system finds coherence at the price of discontinuity and a heterogeneity for which the system cannot account, that of the soul and the body. Beyond this discontinuity, it must be seen that Descartes, for the being privileged in individuality, the fact of being adult and active, productive and free. But individuality also involves other complementary aspects that are just as important and cannot be separated from the first. The individual is not just a created being, he is also an engendered being who dies. Timelessness does not exist for the individual, although he is aware of timelessness. This vital aspect of the individual, through which he belongs to communities, through which he originates in groups and has traditions, through which he is determined in advance to act in ways that are all plotted out, has not been contemplated by Descartes. His search for universality is precisely what allows the individual to not merely be the being who behaves and who is determined, integrated. It nonetheless remains that the Cartesian conception of the individual is still an optative, more so than an elucidation of the real as a whole. This seems like another instance of a problem of participation that Simondon solves with with his philosophy of the pre-individual and individuation, because there is kind of something like a formal reality distinct from the body that produces or that confronts the vital individual with affect when affect becomes a separate problematic, as he says in volume 1. But it's the pre-individual, and it's not like a god of the body, which is what he is insinuating Descartes would require, because it's the same pre-individual that causes the vital individuation and the psychic individuation.
Yeah, I think here we can think of the indefinite dyad that we were talking about before we started recording. So in sensation, in pleasure and pain, the body has a reaction to some affection that it receives from other bodies. So there's in pleasure and pain, there's a sort of motion towards and a motion away from whatever the affection is. And so there's a greater degree of reality or a lesser degree of reality that we experience as pleasure and pain. And there's a kind of it's because there's this sort of indefinite dyad of the living being, or this relation of the living being to something outside itself, which has the form of this indefinite dyad. It's precisely because of this that we can't understand the living being as something as just a piece of extension in the way that Descartes wants to understand it. And so, like for Descartes, the human heart is just an extremely complicated mechanism, like a watch, more perfect because it's created by God and not by finite like us. And it just operates through the motion of various pieces of extension that impact each other in various ways and interlock and produce all sorts of effects that we call life. But this sort of leaves out the interrelation or the status of being that relation has. It leaves out the whole aspect of the pointing towards something outside of itself in the indefinite dyad that Simondon identifies. And so he points out in the later part of this paragraph that a living being is not just sort of an immediate product of God as a created being, but also a being that is engendered by certain parents, that has a childhood, that grows up, learns certain traditions and a particular culture, and and so the individual is sort of embedded in a world in a way that Descartes doesn't account for or has to exclude in order to make the vital reality, in order to reduce vital reality to purely the operations of extension in motion. And it's this sort of pointing beyond itself that or this embeddedness in something outside of itself that Simondon is identifying here as being the sort of aspect that Descartes has to leave out in order to allow for his mechanical system to sort of take effect.
What is excluded there sounds a lot like world in the like Heideggerian sense to me.
Yeah, I think so in Being in Time, Heidegger uses Descartes as a sort of foil. He presents the Cartesian conception of extension as being the sort of degradation of the concept of distance and the way that Dasein is related to other entities in the world. And I think Simondon is making, in some ways, a similar argument, but also a somewhat different argument, because he thinks that he doesn't see Descartes as sort of a degradation or a loss of that world aspect that Heidegger points to. I think he sees the mechanical philosophy of Descartes as something valuable, as sort of grasping an aspect of the world, but at the same time it sort of leaves out another aspect of the world. And the idea for Simondon is not to say that the world in the Heideggerian sense is sort of primary and more important than Cartesian extension, but rather that we should be able to think both of them at the same time. We have to be able to understand living beings as entities that are physical, that have mechanical parts in the ways that Descartes identifies, or there's physiological operations of joints and muscles and all this stuff that physiologists study. But then at the same time, there's this embeddedness in something, or this pointing towards something outside of the living being that is not purely mechanical, that we also have to be able to grasp at the same time. So whereas for Heidegger, there's a kind of focus on the world aspect as being more fundamental, and then the Cartesian extension as derived from it and a kind of falling away from a grasp of the world. For Simondon, what he wants to do is to grasp both at the same time. Yeah, I think in general, whenever Simondon comes across some sort of binary opposition, he wants to find a way of making them compatible, making the two terms compatible. This is his sort of general schema for problem solving is some sort of opposition or incompatibility, and then finding or inventing a new dimension, a new organization of the problem space that allows for those two incompatibles to become compatible. And so that's what he's trying to do here, I think, as well. Okay, let's go on from the special mode of intelligibility. If someone else would like to read.
No, I can do it.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry. So that's page 5, 6. Could you tell me like the exact page? I just kind of get lost here.
Right. So on the PDF, it's page 571.
So again, did you get the point?
Yeah. So it's the first full paragraph. So starting from the special mode of intelligibility.
Okay. Sorry and thank you. The special mode of intelligibility of the rapport of the soul and the body is a finality which excluded from physics reigns sovereignly over the union of the soul and the body. A union which, however, is merely an interaction that remains unknown in its causality. This union of the soul and the body is willed by nature for the conservation of our being. In this sense, the proximate cause of the passions are ignored, but they can be comprehended by recognizing their utility, which consists in the fact that they strengthen and prolong thoughts in the soul, which it is good for the soul to preserve, and which otherwise might be easily erased from it. In the same way, it reflects actions like the pupillary reflex are finalized and depend on the will. This also applies to the movement of the lips and tongue, which serve to pronounce words, and which are called voluntary because they follow from the wish to speak, even though we often ignore which ones must be used in the pronunciation of each letter. End of quote. The notions of force, of substantial forms, of finality are not illusory in themselves. They are true relative to the union of the soul and the body, according to which a spiritual being acts within an extended being. The medicine of the passions consists in relating the passions to their proper finality. Physical therapeutics in intellectual therapeutics give to the power of the will a sovereign authority over the passions. The soul does not add any force to the body. It is not a driving force and does not increase the quantity of movement. The soul acts like a horseman on his mount, changing the animal's direction without modifying its momentum. In the description that he gives, Descartes seems to find an example in the automatons that he came to admire in the king's gardens. These automatons generally utilize the pressurized water as a driving force. Multi-port valves moved by unspecified physical effects, like the action of a stroller on a flagstone, distributed this water into various motorized devices, thereby executing movements in articulated statues. These commands could also be left to the hydraulic engineer's discretion, who could act with the slightest energy on the valves and distribute the water to his liking, thus executing considerable movements surpassing the energy that a man can deploy. In this fashion, with the slightest movement of the hand, one can work hydraulic press connected to a source of a pressurized water. Constructed as a multitude of hydraulic pistons, these automatic statues could be endowed by the hydraulic engineer with a certain automatism. For the accomplishment of fast movement could trigger another movement, which itself would control a third in such a way as to bring about a recurrent series. Descartes entrusts the pioneer gland in the human body with the role played in the automatic statues by the multi-port valves. Pressurized water is represented by the sanguinary vapor, which is the most volatile part of the blood, vaporized by the heat of the heart, which constitutes the animal spirits. Descartes consequently supposed that the soul can direct the movement of the animal spirits by exposing a certain orifice of the efferent nervous frenulums of the pineal gland. This pressurized vapor will then inflate a certain vessel, and by expanding it, will shorten it like an extensible balloon that becomes inflated and takes on a spherical form. The nervous frenulums are conceived as tiny tubules whose diameter is nonetheless sufficient due to the extreme subtlety of the gas called animal spirits. Today, we call a device like the one Descartes imagines in the pineal gland a relay, and it is indeed correct that a relay can, which as little energy as one desires, command a quite considerable amount of energy without adding to, or taking away from it. But still, the control energy must exist and be able to exert an action on the control device of the effector energy. It is difficult to conceive how the soul, without being res extensa, could control the animal spirits in the pineal gland. The inverse action. Stop
Ollie?
here.
Yeah, that's up here. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Right. So this is now passing to the physics of or the physiology of the human body and the sort of quasi solution that Descartes presents of how the soul acts on the body to bring about voluntary movement. And so in Descartes physics, there's a conservation of motion of the quantity of motion as opposed to in later physical systems, we have a conservation of momentum. And the difference here, the key difference, is that the quantity of motion is the same, no matter what direction that motion is going in. So what this allows for, this is a sort of opening for the soul to act on the direction of motion of the animal spirits. So this is for Descartes, the animal spirits are a sort of gas that is produced by or out of the blood, and it fills the nerves, and then the soul acts on the pineal gland, which is a particular gland in the brain, and in this pineal gland, the soul is able to change the direction of motion and bring about some sort of transfer of the motion from one direction to another within the nerves in the body. Yes, so the quantity of motion is a scalar, and then and it doesn't have direction, whereas momentum is a vector which has both magnitude and direction. And yeah, so for Descartes, the world of the res extensa is characterized by conservation of motion, of the scalar quantity of motion, and it's only through the intervention of the soul that the direction of that motion within the human body is realized. And so he gives a physiological explanation of how, for example, the soul can bring about, say, the movement of my arm. So the soul imprints a certain direction on the animal spirits within the pineal gland in my brain, which is transmitted through the nerves down my arm and acts on the muscle in my arm to make it contract and then bend my arm and so on. And so this whole sort of model, it's a kind of hydraulic model of human physiology. And Simoneau points to there were these sort of famous hydraulic statues at Versailles around this time, that operated, so that they had, of course, operated on water pressure, but the motion of these hydraulic statues was controlled by these various valves that were sort of moved by the motion of the people as they walked through the garden where these statues were found. So if you step on a certain tile, then the pressure of your foot will open a valve which allows the water to pass through the tubes in the statue, and then the statue moves or does something, whatever exactly it was. And some of these statues were quite sophisticated. That, like, it wasn't just sort of one movement, but one movement leads to another movement, which brings about a third movement, and so on. So there was a sort of succession of movements, and not just one simple movement. And so this kind of automatic mechanism is how Descartes understands the functioning of the human body. So the nerves are these tiny tubes that contain animal spirits that bring about the motions of various parts of the body. And so Simondon compares this to a regulator of some kind. So there's a kind of so you can control a greater energy using a lesser energy, and he's given examples of this, like in the other book, on the mode of existence of technical objects. He talks about how in a vacuum tube there's the command energy and the I forget what the other energy is called, but anyway, there's you can use a very small quantity of energy to control a very large quantity of energy. But he points out here that where Descartes' model sort of breaks down is the fact that we can't conceive of the action of the soul as a very small quantity of energy. The very small doesn't really help us at all. There's still a heterogeneity, a radical heterogeneity between the soul and the body. And in order for the soul to have any kind of action on the body, it would have to have a kind of energy that is capable of acting on the body. And so it would have to be homogeneous with the body in that sense. And so because Descartes insists on this radical heterogeneity of the soul and the body, this very small energy, this control energy of the soul, doesn't really help us to understand the union of the body and the soul. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. I can read a page or so of this multi-page paragraph. Right. The inverse action is just as possible and is effective in passion. The passions are, quote, feelings or emotions of the soul which we relate specifically to it, and which are caused, maintained, and fortified by some movement of the animal spirits, unquote. Now, even if it is simply difficult to conceive how the soul can control the animal spirits, it is impossible to conceive how the animal spirits can act on the soul based on the pineal gland itself. If this gland is structured in such a way as to behave as a relay, it specifically prevents the reflexive action of the controlled energy on the control energy. A relay transmits causality in a rigorously irreversible way. Without this condition, it couldn't do its job. Conceived as a possible action in two directions, communication is not possible according to the Cartesian schema of the link between the soul and the body. The profound reason for this impossibility is that Descartes only acknowledges instantaneous actions without duration. So a reciprocal action upholding the energetic distinction of the terms of the relation is only possible if the energetic action of one of the terms on the other is deferred and persists as potential energy for a certain amount of time. There is nothing more opposed to the Cartesian conception of being than potential. Everything is actual for Descartes, and his critique of Aristotle's physics is primarily a critique of potential reality. This refusal of all potentials goes all the way to rejecting action at a distance, to such an extent that the notion of a field of forces is deprived of meaning for Descartes, and to such an extent that he wanted to interpret Gilbert's experiments on magnetic fields in terms of action by contact, at the price of quite incoherent hypotheses. Only the action of shock mechanics is real for Descartes, and yet it can be wondered if the individual may be conceived as a totally actual being, fully given in the instant. This postulate of Descartes is also a limit. Thus it becomes clear that the ultimate aspect of morality is not exercise of the will. The soul has its own separate pleasures, and more generally it has passions that do not depend on the body. Sovereign beatitude depends on these passions. The passions that constitute our beatitude must arise from the clear and distinct idea of human nature. Here is where the final aspect of the paradox of individuality intervenes for Descartes. We know ourselves clearly not just as a being endowed with a free will and a soul united with a body, but as part of a whole without which we could not survive. Quote, each of us is really one of the many parts of the universe, and more particularly a part of the earth, the state, the society, and the family to which he belongs by pledge and by birth. And the interests of the whole, of which each of us is a part, must always be preferred to those of our particular person. This is the way in which a, quote, intellectual love, unquote, towards the whole to which we owe our perfections is defined. This reasoned love can estimate our relative value with respect to the whole. It increases to the extent that this value diminishes. Descartes declares that we should sacrifice ourselves only for what has more value than us. If a man through his death can keep all the inhabitants of a village from being executed, and if he estimates that together they all have more value than him, he must sacrifice himself. If not, he shouldn't. In literature, the notion of esteem is the degradation of this reasoned love defined by Descartes. The estimation of our value is the fruit of generosity, passion representative of the search for truth when this passion concerns ourselves. Human value resides in the will and in the steadiness with which it always decides on what appears to the intelligence as the best. Humility or contempt have no meaning at that point, because in everyone free will is infinite and capable of an equal virtue. This dependence is highlighted with regard to God in particular. Quote, before he sent us into the world, he knew exactly what all the inclinations of our will would be. He knew that our free will would determine us to such or such an action, and he so willed it, unquote. Consequently, quote, abandoning oneself completely to his will, one rids oneself of one's particular interest and has no other passion save to do what one believes to be agreeable to him. This conclusion is not absolutely in agreement with the starting point. A gap remains between Descartes' provisional morality and his definitive morality. Through the rule of decision, provisional morality contributes an extremely new conception of action that turns the individual into an absolute principle of action. On the contrary, wisdom involves a number of precepts that would only be justified absolutely in a pantheistic cosmology and metaphysics that herald the thought of Spinoza. This duality comes from the duality that persists in the reality of the individual. The God to which the notion of the infinite and the perfect refers is not in the same relation with respect to us as the God that has destined us to a certain body, to belong to a certain society, and to be born at a certain moment. The existence of the individual as principle of action and of certain knowledge does not fully coincide with his existence as part of a community and ultimately as part of the world, with a given body and engaged in a given circumstance. In the first sense, the individual is like a principle. In the second sense, he is part of the whole and does not have within himself his entire reason for existing. God, creator of true and immutable natures, or of the idea of the infinite and the perfect, is not necessarily at the same time creator of relation in the here and now. For this latter relation is not known through intellectual intuition. It is not a structure. This relation can only be lived and not thought. It is difficult to readmit at the level of wisdom that whose elimination has been practiced at the time of methodical doubt as a condition of the position of the first judgment of existence, which is at the same time the paradigm of every valid affirmation, the cogito.
Oh, this is profound. No idea.
Yeah, Descartes is, he's kind of the bad guy of philosophy for the last 100 years or so. Everyone sort of wants to say, like, criticize someone else as being Cartesian or say that they're sort of surpassing Descartes and so on. But I think, there's a lot obviously in Descartes that we would want to sort of distinguish ourselves from and criticize and so on. But at the same time, he's a very he's a very clear and systematic thinker. So you can always find a problem specified in a very clear way in Descartes that sort of sets the stage for other people that have to sort of address the problem that Descartes poses, even if he doesn't give a satisfactory solution to it. And so I think, and the other aspect is that he always thinks different topics together in a way that is important, I think, for later philosophy. So he doesn't just sort of give his opinions on one topic and then give his opinions on some other topic. He's always thinking about, how does the physics of the theory of motion, how does that relate to morality and the freedom of the will, for example. Those are topics that might seem completely distinct, but for Descartes, we have to sort of have an understanding. He wants to have a system of thought that allows us to understand both of those things together, and I think that's admirable as well.
What struck me? Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was the comments on ethic, because I never characterized the thought had never crossed my mind until the end of the segment.
Maybe
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to answer that first before I'll let you comment after that, Ali. Yeah. So we saw a little bit earlier the provisional ethics or provisional morality that Descartes sort of specifies as how we have to guide ourselves in the meantime while we're waiting for science to be completed. But there's also a sort of I guess final morality that comes after the system of science is completed, and this there even though they should sort of coincide, there's a kind of gap between them because there's always this aspect that Descartes tries to leave out of science, which is sort of the insertion in the world that we talked about earlier. So it's not just I, as an ethical agent or a moral agent, am not just a sort of free thought, this sort of principle of thinking that exists independently of anything around me. I'm a person that lives in a particular city and country. I have particular friends and family and so on, and I have to act in relation to all of those things. I can't just sort of abstract from all those things and sort of come up with ethical principles that define my action in abstract terms. I have to act in relation to these concrete circumstances where I find myself. And Descartes doesn't really have, or this is a sort of problem that Descartes ends up with because he doesn't have a good way of explaining how we should understand this insertion into the world and into these circumstances where we find ourselves.
I meant to just like tag the previous question. That's why I tried to say the question related to the previous question of 61 is that like for Descartes, like was there any kind of distinction between the concept of morality and the ethics? Because as far as I understand, like to the Spinoza, or going further, definitely ethics and then morality has their own distinctions. And the second, as far as I understand it, Descartes, in a way, like he dealt with the human being as an individual, just part of the whole community. As far as I understand, like he seemed not to allow like individuals like to experience some kind of transition or modification or change in it. So it just like a function as a part of the whole community. So it's in a way like it sounds really rational and logical, but if it goes down to the individual level, Descartes, like did he really like think of individuality of individual, like because like the last part is really something like has something in it, and then in terms of a relation between the community and the individual as well. So these kind of question two of the things. First one is differentiation between morality and ethics in terms of Cartesian idea, and the second one is like individual in terms of like the part of community. How does it function like in terms of a Cartesian idea?
Yeah, those are both good questions. I think on the first one, I don't think Descartes makes a distinction between ethics and morality or morals. The term that he uses is morals. Like he talks about a provisional morals. I'm not sure if he ever uses the term ethics to describe what he wants to do. I'd have to, like I'm not a sort of Descartes expert. I'd have to sort of take a look and see if I can find that somewhere. But yeah, so he generally uses the term morals, but I don't think he ever makes a distinction between morals and ethics. So it's interesting that Spinoza, in developing a sort of post-Cartesian system of thought, he chooses the term ethics as opposed to morals for his book, which we can maybe see as an attempt to differentiate himself or differentiate what he's doing from Descartes' project of the provisional morality, because Spinoza's system of ethics is not supposed to be provisional in the way that Descartes' system of morals is. The system of ethics is deduced from our knowledge of God and our our knowledge of the soul and so on. All of that is part of the deductive science. So ethics is a deductive science for Spinoza in a way that morals is not for Descartes.
Okay, thank you.
So on the second question about this relationship between the individual and the community for Descartes, so I think you're right to say that Descartes doesn't have an understanding or a way of presenting how an individual can change over the course of an action. And for Simondon, this is sort of a key idea. So if we want to conceive of solving a problem, we have to think of the individual to whom the problem is posed as going through some sort of transformation. Otherwise, it's not really a problem. If we can face a situation and resolve whatever difficulty we're faced with without undergoing any sort of transformation, then it's not, that situation was not really a problem. It's only when we have to undergo a transformation and bring about the compatibility between something that was incompatible that we are actually faced with a problem. And so Descartes has, as the quote that Simondon gives here, talks about how before I was ever created, God knew what I would choose in every circumstance. So even though I have free will, God knew what I would freely choose to do in all the different circumstances that come up in my life. And so there's a kind of predestination of all of my decisions, and this does sort of make it difficult to understand what exactly that freedom consists in if all of my decisions are sort of known in advance. But because all of my decisions are known in advance, it means that what I choose to do in a particular situation can never transform who I am. Like the future course of my life is already determined, even if I experience myself as making various choices in particular situations. And so this is another sort of difficulty for Descartes of trying to give an explanation of how we can, or the difficulty is that he sort of has to exclude the whole aspect of decision and problem solving as bringing about a transformation of the individual, and instead he has to think of the individual as something that is determined already from its creation, as its whole life course is already determined.
Oh, interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. Let me just, was there anything else I wanted to mention in this passage? Oh yes, I wanted to explain briefly the bit about the magnet here that Simondon brings up. So Descartes, so Gilbert wrote a book in the 17th century. I forget exactly the year, but he wrote a book about magnets, and magnets were sort of an object of fascination throughout from I guess the medieval period onwards, because they have this. It's easy to explain the operation of a magnet in Aristotelian terms, like the magnet, the compass needle has an attraction to the north. It's drawn towards the north. It sort of wants to point north, and so if you pull the compass needle in another direction, or move it away from that orientation, it sort of automatically or through its own action, it turns itself back towards the north. And so this is something you can sort of easily make sense of in Aristotelian terms. But if you want to have a mechanical physics, so a physics that doesn't appeal to final causes and doesn't appeal to the direction of entities towards a goal, then magnets are sort of a problem case, and you have to have some sort of explanation of how a magnet can operate through purely mechanical causes. And Descartes comes up with this complicated explanation in terms of vortices. So it's sort of like a whirlpool. There's like all these, the magnet emits these tiny particles that circle around in these complex vortices, and these vortices sort of impact, these tiny particles impact the compass needle and cause it to point north, for example. And what Simondon points out in one of the footnotes here is that Descartes' explanation only it only accounts for half of the phenomena that we see with magnets. So you can use this whirlpool or vortex explanation to account for how magnets attract each other, or how two like magnets oppose each other, repel each other, but you can't account for both at the same time. So if the vortex goes in one direction, you can account for the attraction of two opposite poles of a magnet, or if the vortex goes in the other direction, you can account for the repulsion of two like poles of a magnet from each other, but you can't account for both at the same time, because then the vortex would have to go in both directions at the same time. And so Descartes' physics is completely devoid of any notion of action at a distance. And there was a whole controversy later in the 18th century between the Cartesians and the Newtonians when Newton introduces the notion of gravity as action at a distance. The Cartesians argue that this is a sort of obscure quality, occult quality, I should say. It's a like similar to scholastic notions like the the heavy objects sort of wanting to be towards the center of the universe. And so for Cartesians, you need to have a mechanical explanation of why heavy objects stick to the earth and or fall towards the ground and so on. So this is sort of one of the fundamental oppositions in 17th and 18th century physics, is between the Cartesians and then later the Newtonians, that allow for something like action at a distance. Okay, I said we were going to finish in an hour and a half, but it ended up being closer to 2 hours anyway. But yeah, we're at a end point here, so let's stop here for today, and we'll pick up on the section on. There's a short section on Pascal. Let's see. Well, it's not that short. Maybe 4 pages, 5. Yeah, a couple pages on Pascal, and then on to Spinoza after that.
Okay. Thank you so much. See you next week.
That sounds great. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.